I'm so excited that my first guest is Christopher Langan, the smartest man in the world.
Man with the world's highest IQ, Christopher Langan, is gaining a following on the far right.
This is Chris Langan, and he's one of the most intelligent people in the world.
So are you saying that this guy is a white supremacist?
That's what I read.
It would be great if more people would read Socrates. The problem is that he never wrote anything down, you moron.
Post about conspiracy theories and how gorillas are apparently smarter than Somalis.
So after telling us that nobody alive today is worth reading, his first examples of super important people from history that we should all read includes one who never wrote anything. This is how you know Chris is completely full of shit.
Birth control. Simply implant that in all children at age 10.
That's enough.
TTMU can be regarded as a super tautological reality theoretic extension of logic. What the fuck does that mean?
Chris has one of, if not the highest IQ ever recorded.
You'd think that if every single interview with this guy is going to center around this singular statistic, that we'd have seen some physical evidence of this test result at some point. No? Just me? Okay, continue.
So did Chris Langan fake his IQ? Everyone on the internet is completely obsessed with this guy right now, with video after video coming out titled World's Smartest Man, Does God Exist? Man with 200 IQ explains the secrets of reality. 200 IQ man, sleep is not what you think. He's been getting called the world's smartest man by articles, magazines, and news stations, and his interview on YouTube is at over 10 million views. But since he doesn't have any real scientific accomplishments, his whole fame is sort of piggybacking off the idea that he has a 200 IQ. The problem is, nobody that interviews him even knows where he gets this IQ from. If you look online, it says he got his IQ from the Mega Test, but what it doesn't tell you is that the Mega Test is a take-home test from the back of a magazine, and it wasn't made by psychologists like real IQ tests. It was made by a philosopher who used estimations for the IQ scores. And Chris has been exposed several times for being a white supremacist. Unfortunately, it seems like no one on the internet, not even Professor Dave, knows about this. Even gigantic names like Joe Rogan have gone on record defending and complimenting Chris Langan.
Wait a minute, are you talking about that guy? They did a documentary on him back in the day, the smartest man in the world. He was a bouncer. Man with the world's highest IQ, Christopher Langan, is gaining a following on the far right. So are you saying that this guy is a white supremacist?
That's what I read.
That's what you read where, though? Inviting the interest of alt-right readers. Okay. What does that mean? Inviting the interest of alt-right readers. Just because people read him.
I don't like this style of journalism.
I don't like this at all.
I'd like them to just quote him.
Exactly. This is horseshit.
Joe Rogan was mad that the article didn't use real quotes, so let's get him some real quotes. On Facebook in 2019, Chris said that gorillas, quote, have a group mean IQ at least equal to that of Somalia, and asked why we admit African refugees but not gorillas, since they have the same IQ and are less violent. He cites Somalia's IQ at 68, while Coco the gorilla's IQ was measured between 75 and 95. What he probably doesn't realize is that Coco's IQ estimate comes from an IQ test designed for infants, that is, children under 12 months old, while the number he cites for Somalians, 68, is from a normal IQ test. But I guess the smartest man in the world doesn't need to check his sources because he's only supporting racism. It's not like it's anything important. To make things worse, the Somalian IQ test wasn't given to adults, but rather to Somali children living in a refugee camp in Kenya, and the test itself was measured against students from the UK. I guess it's really groundbreaking news that malnourished children from a refugee camp did worse than British kids from a first world country. The only reason that the 68 number gets cited at all is because it was used in the extremely popular book Wealth of Nations. The author, known white supremacist Richard Lynn, makes these tables where he uses his own formulas along with studies he finds on the internet to estimate IQs for every country in the world, and he's the citation on almost all of those national IQ tables that you'll find on the internet. He's been exposed numerous times for biasing his datasets against Africans, and specifically relying on small sample sizes of children suffering from malnutrition and other disadvantages. My personal favorite example is an IQ estimate of 59 he gave to Equatorial Guinea, which he took from a Spanish school for the developmentally disabled. Of course, none of this stops people from looking up Somalia's IQ on Google and then making racist memes out of the first search result, or I guess in Chris's case, a racist Facebook post.
He's very intelligent. Like when you hear him talk.
But back to the point of the video, did Chris Langan fake his IQ? Well, firstly, what is his IQ? According to Chris, it's somewhere between 190 and 210.
My IQ would be somewhere between 190 and 210.
Thank you, Chris. Now, where does he get this number? The CTMU wiki, which is a fan wiki dedicated entirely to Chris that's maintained by his Facebook group, shows the two tests that allegedly prove Chris's IQ. That's the admissions test for the Mega Society and the WAIS-III test that he took on ABC News. Now, the WAIS-III has a maximum score of 155, so we'll look at that one later and start with a mega test. And here it is, the world's hardest IQ test. Chris found this test in the back of a science fiction magazine called Omni in a column titled Games, and this is the exact version of the mega test Chris took to earn his alleged 200 IQ. We know this is the same test because Chris talks about taking this test on his wiki here from Omni magazine while he was working as a bouncer. It's also the same test that was popularized by other 200 IQ individuals like Marilyn von Savant and Rick Rossner. Now, is this test legit? Well, not really. It's from the back of a magazine and wasn't made by a group of psychologists like real IQ tests. It has no formal accreditation, and the guy who made it, Ronald Hoeflin, is a philosopher who didn't follow standard psychometric procedure. We'll get into that later, but the big problem with the mega test is that unlike real IQ tests that have a time limit and someone watching you to make sure you don't cheat, the mega test is one you do at home with books and calculators allowed, and when you finish, you submit the test in the mail to the Mega Society along with $5 for the grading fee. The rules say you can use whatever materials you want as long as you don't ask other people for help or share answers, and as for a time limit, they recommend you spend no longer than a month on the test, which is crazy because 1, that means you can spend longer than a month if you want to, and 2, who in their right mind would take a month-long IQ test? So keep in mind, when Chris says he got the world's highest score on this IQ test, the people he was competing against were only those that found this exact section from this exact issue of this magazine and were also willing to spend a month of their life filling out this test from the back of a magazine. So now, let's look at the actual questions on the test. The first section is a fill in the blank. As a sample, they give you hot is to cold as pyro is to what? The answer is cryo. Pyro is a science term for hot, cryo is a science term for cold, so basically you're just finding words that are related, which of course is stupid because you could just search through a dictionary for hours until you find words that fit. After all, there is no time limit, then just hope the guy who made the test, Ronald Hoeflin, had the same answer as you. It gets worse though, as the questions get less and less about actually being hard to figure out and more about just sounding smart. Question 17 asks, a 4-sided polyhedron is to a tetrahedron, as a 4-dimensional hypercube is to what? The answer is a tesseract. This is the mathematical name for this, and a tesseract is the mathematical name to that. This just reeks of some snooty, pretentious person trying their absolute hardest to sound smart. There is nothing hard about this question. That is, as long as you happen to know the math name for a 4-dimensional hypercube and have the extremely surface level understanding that both of these shapes are known for having equal sides. The obvious solution to this test is not to be smart, but just to pour through a dictionary for hours until you know the technical name for this and the technical name for that. Again, on question 2, heel is to Achilles as box is to what? This is referring to Pandora's box, a Greek myth. The Achilles heel is a Greek myth, Pandora's box is a Greek myth. There's nothing hard about this problem as long as you know the title to both these myths. It's basically just a pop culture reference, except because this is the world's hardest IQ test, everything has to be about ancient Greece or use some technical math terms so that people who don't know what's going on will just chalk it up as smart people shit. They'll see words like teeth, hen, nest and think, oh, I don't know how those are connected, when the solution was an 18th century piece of slang that people don't use anymore. Now there's also some problems with shapes and numbers. I didn't want to waste my time having to break these down too, but luckily some guy on Reddit seems to have already gone through these problems for me. According to him, these are mostly intro-level math questions that have already been publicly solved, then just got reworded and pasted onto the tests. Starting with problem 35 for an example, which asks you to figure out the maximum number of pieces that you can make out of a cube by slicing it 5 times. This problem was solved back in the 1800s by Steiner, and the solution is this formula right here, n being the number of slices. Anyone who's passed high school algebra can just plug 5 in for n, and boom, 26 pieces, that's the answer. The problem here is that anyone can just learn how to solve these questions from a textbook, or because they've already studied this type of math. Again, there is no time limit, so the most motivated test takers are just going to keep studying math until they find out how to solve it, which usually comes down to some easy formula. In other words, there's nothing in the IQ test that an average person couldn't learn to solve. At least, that's what I thought until I saw this question. It asks you to figure out how many distinct patterns you could make from a cube with 3 different colors. Now, this might not sound that hard at first, but you have to figure out how to exclude the hundreds of patterns that are identical, but just rotated a bit. Doing this requires knowing something called Burnside's lemma, which, what the fuck is this? I think me and this guy on Reddit have a very different definition of what we consider easy math problems. But then I remembered, nothing on this test is hard. The test makers just do everything they can to make it look hard, when in reality, all of this stuff is just surface level problem solving, hiding behind scary words, or in this case, scary symbols. So even though I don't know what any of this means, I took it upon my lazy ass self to learn how to solve this on my own. And after 2 minutes of watching a YouTube video and talking a little bit with ChatGPT, which had me start with a triangle and then work up to bigger shapes, it turned out to actually be pretty simple. Solving the problem just boils down to counting how many ways the cube can be rotated in different planes, and then you just start adding up everything and plugging in the values. I'm oversimplifying it a little, but the point is you can learn how to solve these problems. It might take a while, especially if you aren't naturally good at math, but if you've done high school calculus, I promise that you've done problems a lot harder than this. But more importantly, this is all just math, and we already have real math competitions with problems much, much harder than this. And to be clear, a real mathematician would absolutely murder a test like this. And Chris bashes real academics like this constantly.
If you took the very best minds from the very best universities in the world, they wouldn't be able to put a dent in me or my theory.
He also brags constantly about his incredible genetics, usually while ranting about white women and how they should be flocking to have children with him, saying on Twitter he's in the perfect position to know that white women couldn't care less about genetics, and that any child fathered by him would have a priceless intellectual legacy, and that these women would have one of the world's most intelligent and large-brained people as a biological baby daddy.
I like to maintain a little bit of modesty because it's healthy to do that. It's not healthy to get a big head.
If he wants to publicly bash people who have actual accomplishments that are a lot harder than the questions he found on the back of this magazine, then he needs to commit to an actual hard science and actually do something and not just books on philosophy. He's claimed real accomplishments, like that he solved the famously unsolved P versus NP problem, which is a math problem with $1 million prize, but says he won't submit the solution because he says that the biased prize committee wouldn't accept his solution if he did. So how did Chris do on the mega test? Well, in his first try, Chris got a 42 out of 48. He claimed this was because the cutoff for joining the High IQ Society was 42 out of 48, and he didn't feel the need to get a higher score. Then when he found out the cutoff had been changed to 43 out of 48, he said he got cheated out of joining the society and took the test again, this time under a pseudonym, Eric Hart, and scoring 47 out of 48. Chris was finally admitted to the Mega Society, but Chris's story about not trying to score high on his first try is suspicious for a few reasons. Firstly, there was a $5,000 prize that month for the highest score, which would have been a lot to Chris at the time, who says he was quite poor and working as a bouncer. Second, Chris said there was no advantage to taking the test twice, but that's not quite true. If he filled out all the questions and got a 42 out of 48, he would now know that he needs to change at least 6 of his answers and keep 42 of them, which could also clue him into which ones he might have gotten wrong and give him another chance to get the right answer. Also, the one question Chris missed on his second attempt was this one, where he says he answered nonile instead of novile. But if such a small mistake could cost him a point, why would he only try and get exactly 42 correct and risk wasting all his time and money with just one mistake? To top it off, by paying $5 more, you could get a test analysis breaking down your score, which, if Chris paid for, could have clued him into which questions he got wrong the first time. Until we see real evidence for Chris's story, I don't think we can take his word on this. But regardless, on his second try, he still got a 47 out of 48, which at this point in 1986 was the highest anyone had gotten on this test, even though we don't know how many people actually took the test. The creator of the test, Ronald Hoeflin, made a chart showing what score corresponds with what IQ, and this is where Chris Langan got his IQ from. As you can see, a score of 47 on this test correlates with an IQ of 190 to 200, with 190 being the opinion of the test creator himself. I assume Chris says 190 to 210 because he thinks the nonile novile dilemma was an unfair way to lose a point, and he says it wouldn't have happened if he had access to a library. So my guess is that in his mind, the test didn't really cap out his IQ, and he believes it could be upwards of 210. Now, 210 is a really high IQ.
210 seems very, very, very high.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
It does seem that way, in fact. Looking at an IQ percentile chart, it caps out at an IQ of 202, which correlates to 1 in 190 billion people. An IQ of 210, like Chris claims to have, would be 1 in 8.9 trillion people. That's 1,000 times the population of Earth. People love throwing around huge IQ numbers for free internet points, but IQ, as it's defined by psychologists, is based on a percentile using a scale called 15SD. For every 15 IQ points, you have to beat 1 standard deviation of test takers. That means you have to beat exponentially more and more people the higher in IQ you go. These test takers you have to beat are a randomly chosen group of people that psychologists have take the test under controlled conditions, and an IQ is only considered psychometrically valid when it's derived from a percentile like this. So in other words, statistically, nobody can claim to have an IQ of 210 or 200 since there aren't enough people on Earth to validate your score. In fact, nearly every official IQ test maxes out at around 150, since the test population is usually a couple thousand people. In fact, even scores this high are pretty controversial among psychologists, because if they release the test to the public and someone scores a 150, it's usually more likely they just practiced on the test rather than them actually having 1 in thousands intelligence. After all, the test population that norms the test aren't going to practice beforehand and probably also won't care as much about their scores, so it's not that hard to beat them. Megatest creator Ronald Hoeflin, of course, didn't follow these rules. Instead, he gave the test to 4,000 random people and then used his own formula to create an estimation to decide that 47 out of 48 translated to 1 in 190 billion IQ. We of course know that a 47 out of 48 isn't that rare because TV producer Rick Rossner also got a 47 and Marilyn Von Savant got a 46, both on their first try, unlike Chris who did it on the second. And this was all from just a single test from a single magazine article. Think of all the people who could have also aced a test like this, but never came across this exact section from Omni magazine. So to sum things up, the megatest isn't an official IQ test. It wasn't made by psychologists, but rather by a single philosopher, and its scores are just IQ estimates that weren't validated by a test sample. But that was not the only IQ test Chris took. Chris usually cites the megatest when people ask about his IQ, but his wikis mentioned him taking another very important test. What about the WAIS-III he took on ABC News? The WAIS-III is an official IQ test made by actual psychologists that's been properly tested against a bell curve and is used in research and clinical settings. And Chris took this test in front of an actual neurologist hired by ABC who could verify that Chris's scores were actually real. So how did Chris do on this test? Well, we don't know. They never actually gave us a number, but the neurologist said it was the highest score from anyone he'd ever given the test to.
The highest individual that I have ever measured in 25 years of doing this.
So is that it? Did Chris finally prove his genius? Well, I don't think so. Firstly, the highest score I've ever seen isn't a number, and they never actually told us what he scored on the test. And it doesn't really mean that much considering the most common uses for IQ tests are to assess intellectual disabilities or cognitive impairments. Secondly, the maximum score you can get on this test is 155 IQ or 1 in 8,000, which is still just 0.0000001% of Chris's claimed 210 IQ, which would be 1 in 8.9 trillion. Thirdly, the questions on the WAIS-III have nothing to do with proving genius. Some sections will ask you questions like, in what ways are a lion and a tiger alike? And then your answer gets graded on the depth of your explanation, which is subjectively determined by the test taker, who in this case was hired for a TV segment. General grading guidelines about this section usually say to award points for lengthy and wordy answers, which is not told to the test subject who is just asked, how are they alike? And is obviously going to favor someone like Chris, who loves giving unnecessarily long explanations for things. Like when he explained telic recursion as a fundamental process that tends to maximize a cosmic self-selection parameter, generalized utility over a set of possible syntax. You get the point. The WAIS-III also has a trivia portion. In fact, nearly all official IQ tests do, and it gets labeled as the general knowledge section. I guess poor Einstein wasn't really all that smart if he didn't know pop culture references like who is Batman's butler or what is the capital of Chile. Obviously, these sort of questions aren't going to determine genius, but they do help measure how much general information people pick up and remember throughout their life. There's also a vocab section where the test proctor asks you to define words of increasing difficulty and then judges your explanations based on their quote-unquote sophistication, which is again pretty subjective and also is obviously going to appeal to wordsmith Chris with his telic recursion. I think we can all agree that knowing big words doesn't equal smart and that people can improve their vocab with practice. Of course, people can also practice learning trivia, but a big part of what makes IQ tests work is that they spread out the measured skills between lots of different areas so that no one person has a big advantage across the entire test. That is, unless they are completely and totally obsessed with IQ. Now, we don't know exactly how much practice Chris has with the skills in IQ tests, but first, let's get something clear. The idea of practicing the skills seen on IQ tests to increase your score is a very real and important concept in psychometrics, and surprisingly, it's called the practice effect. r/cognitive tests has a huge community of people that obsess over IQ and IQ testing, and the practice effect is something that is talked about constantly, with people in these communities joking about spending hundreds of hours training IQ skills so that they can brag about acing IQ tests. I only wish I could think of someone who would do such a thing. But anyways, it's a very well understood concept among psychologists that having a greater exposure to IQ tests increases IQ scores. There's lots of studies on the subject, but it's also just pretty obvious that practicing something makes you better at it. But it's important to remember that the practice effect is a quote-unquote bad thing in psychometrics because it creates a disparity between your IQ test score and your actual cognitive G. Cognitive G is sort of like fluid intelligence. It's what IQ is trying to measure. But anyways, back to the WAIS-III, the sections people seem to care the most about are the matrices and shape sections. I guess because people associate them with math and trust math a lot more than vocab or trivia. But the funny thing is, the matrices sections are actually considered the most susceptible of all the sections to the practice effect, probably because they use the same patterns and tricks over and over again. Hey guys, real quick, I had to blur the shape questions from the actual WAIS-III test because they got the original video copyright struck by Pearson. And also, yes, it's pronounced WAIS, not Weiss. I'm pronouncing it wrong in the video. I'm just used to saying it that way. But anyways, the point I was trying to show is that the WAIS-III shape questions were pretty easy, and I think most of you watching probably could have solved them yourself. Oh, and I also had to remove some footage of me explaining the questions, but back to the video. And these two were actually the third and fourth hardest problems in the entire section, which is pretty crazy considering there's no time limit on this portion, so you could just sit there and keep staring at problems like this until you see the pattern, which is especially important for someone like Chris, whose entire reputation is riding on this test, and is obviously not going to move on until he's figured out every single question. After all, ABC reported that Chris spent 2 hours on the test compared to the average time to take it, which is 75 minutes. While a normal person would probably just get bored of naming different ways lions and tigers are alike or staring at pattern problems, Chris could just keep going as long as possible to rack up free points and ensure a higher score. So yes, Chris probably got a high score on this test, but like we discussed earlier, official IQ tests are normed using random test samples of people. So when Chris scores in the top 1%, he's just beating untrained participants who don't spend their free time taking IQ tests. My personal opinion is that Chris, with his reputation relying on IQ as much as it does, is inevitably going to spend some of his free time learning about IQ tests and how to do well on them. I mean, we can clearly see he takes pride in vocab with explanations like this, but even if you disagree and think that Chris doesn't purposely use his free time to research IQ questions like I'm saying he does, I think you should still at least be able to admit that him obsessing over IQ for nearly 30 years and talking about it on every social media platform he has counts as exposure, and him taking the 1 month time limit 48 question mega test twice counts as practice. So to put everything together, the questions on the WAIS-III are all simple, practicable skills that don't prove genius. Chris being obsessed with IQ has definitely exposed himself to the practice effect, and because IQ tests like the WAIS-III are made to estimate fluid intelligence on untrained participants, this means Chris taking the test isn't going to assess his IQ the way that psychologists design these tests to do. And even if we decided his test should be taken at face value, the highest his score could have been would be 155, which still comes nowhere close to proving his claimed range of 195 to 210. And as for the WAIS-III itself, I think it's pretty clear that answering trivia questions and knowing lots of big words doesn't prove genius. The truth is, if you want to make a measurement for intelligence, people who want to be called smart are just going to find ways to exploit it. Meanwhile, people who are actually smart are going to be busy living their lives and making tangible contributions to the world, whether that means doing real science or studying an actual field of academics, or even just raising a family or building relationships. And I'm not going to start digging into Chris's personal life and start saying he needs to go make friends or something stupid like that. But if he wants to roleplay as a genius, he needs to at least do something tangible in a real empirical field of science, instead of just taking IQ tests all day and writing about conspiracies on the internet. He's claimed real scientific accomplishments, like that he solved the $1 million P versus NP math problem, but said he wouldn't submit his solution for it, even though it's $1 million. He also claims he proved God's existence with math in his book, but didn't include anything empirical at all that could test his theory, instead hoping people would just assume it's correct because 200 IQ. This is a pattern with Chris, and it's the way he uses the mysteriousness around what exactly IQ is to shield himself from actually having to list real accomplishments. People like Chris get famous for doing this because IQ itself has such an aura on the internet. I remember being a kid and asking my science teacher what his IQ was, and when he said, like 150, my jaw dropped to the floor. Wow, I knew he was a genius. To a little kid scrolling the internet, there is nothing cooler than a brain super number that instantly tells you how smart someone is. In reality, IQ is made to test general populations on very general skills, not to test for genius. IQ nowadays is associated with statistically impossible IQ scores, tests with answers only findable in old dictionaries, and for making racist memes about Africans. The way people use IQ is a Frankenstein of what psychologists actually made IQ for. IQ is not meant to establish genius, it's most accurate in the mid-ranges, and it's supposed to be a generalized assessment for studying the effects of drugs, diagnosing intellectual disabilities, and stopping stupid people from joining the military, not for proving genius. So, is Chris Langan's IQ fake? While completing the mega test in 1985 was an impressive achievement, it still has nothing to do with IQ as it's defined by psychologists. It wasn't psychometrically normed, and so it wasn't a real IQ test. Additionally, it was a take-home test from the back of a magazine, made by a philosopher, not a psychologist, and his competition pool was only other IQ-obsessed people who also decided to take the same test from the same magazine. And even among that small pool, other people were able to get similar scores. He also scored a 190 on it, which still falls short of his 210 IQ claim. The WAIS-III, on the other hand, is a valid IQ test, but I would argue that Chris's experience taking IQ tests and his obsession with skills associated with IQ tests means that he can't claim an IQ score that's based on untrained participants. However, even if we did accept it, the questions obviously don't support genius, and the test only goes up to 155 anyways, and therefore it doesn't support Chris's IQ claim either. Chris's claimed IQ is also statistically impossible according to the very definition of IQ, which is based on a percentile. And in my opinion, if someone really did have a 200 IQ, it wouldn't be the guy who brags about it nonstop and thinks 9/11 was about him and argues with people on Facebook all day. So to conclude, yes, Chris Langan's IQ is fake, and the 190 to 210 range he claims is completely made up. Now, as this video finally comes to an end, I'd like to finish off with one of my favorite quotes. It's from someone very wise, who's also at times been called the smartest man in the world, and I believe everyone watching can learn something from what he has to say. I turned myself into a pickle, Morty. I'm Pickle Rick.